we will cover kind of broad scale how the ELT is marked, just so that you're aware from a marking perspective what the examiners are looking for. So you'll be assessed across a 13-level scale for every skill. So obviously inside of the ELT, you're looking at reading, listening, speaking, and writing. Like I said, we are focused on the writing side today, but just to be aware, every one of these skills is weighted equally. So even though today we are focused on the writing, it's equally important that you're preparing to the same level with your reading, listening, and speaking as well. There are some really useful links that I'll actually put inside of the WeChat conversation after the session, where kind of some free resources that you can use to practice a couple of practice papers, just to make sure that you're well prepared when you go in. You don't really want to be in the position where you go into the test and it's the first time that you've seen a paper or thought about any of those kinds of questions. So you can see here as well that your ELLT score is actually equivalent to some other kind of English language test scoring systems. So your IELTS equivalent is just below here, and then also the CEFR. These are basic other tests that measure English fluency or someone's ability to understand English across the same 4 skills. So you might have heard maybe of the IELTS or the CEFR fluency bandings. This is just to give you some understanding of what does your ELLT score mean when you receive it. So once you've sat the test, hopefully you guys are scoring in this higher band. What does that actually translate to for you in relation to these other equivalent systems? Any questions on that before we move on? Like I say, just a high overview of how this exam actually maps to other similar exams. I can also send over all the slides afterwards, so don't feel that you have to take too many notes. If everyone's clear on this, we can move on to the actual writing side of the test. Oops, skipped ahead. Okay, so when we're thinking from the perspective of the writing section, there are a couple of key focus points that the examiners are looking for that can be grouped into 6 kind of broad areas that they'll be looking for. The first of these is task achievement, and this one's really easy because all this actually means is that you've written the essay on what they've asked you to. So you've actually responded to the prompt. So whatever that might be, whether it's an essay on the environment or an essay on the school system, whatever it might be, you've achieved that task because you've written an opinion-based essay that focuses on the themes that are related to that. So that's a really easy one, and definitely one that everyone will probably be ticking. It's really helpful though to understand the other things outside of just writing the essay that the examiners are looking for, so that you can help yourselves to prepare and also be comfortable knowing this inside of the exam. The first one that we'll think about is accuracy of language. So this means spelling. So especially with potentially more complex pieces of vocabulary. Oh, someone's just in the waiting room. Just give me a second to let them in. Okay. Especially with more complex pieces of vocabulary, do make sure that you're revising spellings for those particularly kind of sentence starters that you know that you want to use. So thinking of your topic sentences in your paragraphs, your phrases, you don't want to be spelling any of those keywords wrong, because that's something that an examiner will be looking for. So making sure that you're really accurate with your spelling, especially, and this kind of feeds into grammar, spellings as they change from singular to plural nouns. In English, there are a couple of quite strange switches that we make when we move from a singular to a plural noun. So making sure that you're confident in what those are, and the general rules around those will help you be really confident in the accuracy of your spelling throughout the test. This is probably one of the things that will signal to an examiner that you're not particularly confident in your English. This will be a really obvious sign for them. So it's something to make sure that you're especially sure of, making sure that you use 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the exam itself just to review all of the writing that you've done, so that you aren't making any silly spelling errors that you could otherwise avoid. equally to that point, if there is a word that you're not certain that the spelling is correct, try to think of a synonym that you're more confident in, because this spelling point is a large reason that a lot of people do fall down in their banding. So that's something to be aware of. The next thing that an examiner is going to be looking for is what we call the appropriacy of your language. And this means how formal are you being? Are you being particularly colloquial, so maybe a bit too casual in some of the word choices that you're making? Remember that this is an opinion-based essay that you're going to be asked to write. When we move on in today's session actually to look at some examples of written answers, we'll see that a lot of them are ticking this box because they're remaining quite formal. So making sure that it's not you're not using the kind of English that you might use to speak to your friends or over text. It's more the kind of English that you would actually use if you were writing a formal essay, or even kind of mimics that what you might have seen in school. Just making sure that the language you use is appropriate, because if you're starting to use any kind of informal language, and especially slang, that is again something that will trigger to an examiner that your banding needs to be lower. So this again is a huge thing to make sure that you're getting right. The next point is called fluency. This seems like an odd one because obviously the whole test is basically a level, a marking system for how fluent you are with your English. But when we say fluency here, what we mean is how confident is a candidate in actually using idiomatic English. So phrases that don't make any literal sense, but we know that English people use. Great examples of these ones that you will be really well rewarded for using in your language are phrases like on one hand, on the other hand. Now that's an idiom because we don't literally mean something is sat on one of my hands and something is sat on the other hand. What we mean is we're comparing two sides of an argument. So that's a really great idiom to use that will help show an examiner that you're more fluent than people who can't use typical English phrases. And that's why I've included phrases here, because anything that is a formal English phrase, things like in conclusion or to conclude, those show that you are aware of how English on a formal level is used and understood at that higher end of the banding scale, so moving up into your 10s, 11s, 12s. This is a really key one. Like I say, when we're thinking of these top three, these are more things to make sure that you're doing correctly to avoid being placed in a lower band. And these next three are things that you can actually do to enhance the band that you get. So things that will boost you into those 10, 11, 12 categories. Grammar obviously is a big one. I'm sure that you guys will have all have heard of this and its importance. Grammar ranges across so many things. I should probably have put there grammar and syntax. You want to check that your sentences are full and complete, and really basic checks again, like when you're doing your proofreading at the end. Things like, are my commas in the right place? Are my apostrophes in the right place? Have I checked all of my singular nouns, my plural nouns, my verbs? Do they match the subject? As in, have I used a singular verb for a singular person, etc., etc. So really easy checks. Again, this is something that will show to an examiner that you're aware how the English language functions, almost more mathematically, that you're using the right words in the right places and that all of your verbs and nouns match up. So that's something to be considering when you're going through and doing your proof checking. The final point here is vocabulary, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet that you can use to supplement some of your practice ahead of the exam that will enhance your vocabulary. You want to make sure that you're being ambitious with your vocabulary. You want to show that you are not just using really basic, rudimentary English that everyone else is using. So try to be ambitious with your vocabulary, but make sure that you're aware of how to spell those more ambitious words that you are using. Showing that you have a varied set of vocabulary is one of the main and probably easiest ways that you can actually boost your score in the ELLT, just because you can check that you're not using the same words, so you don't repeat any keywords. One of the key things in the writing section is actually to try avoid repeating too many times the words from the question itself. You might want to refer to them once or twice at the start of your paragraph, but actually showing that you're aware of the synonyms for those words and other appropriate word choices, again, is a really easy way for an examiner to see that you're quite advanced with your English level. So try to think about avoiding repetition, exploring synonyms, and being ambitious, using words that you know not everyone sitting the test is actually going to focus on. Does anyone have any questions about any of these 6 points before we move on to a quick look at how you can approach structuring your ELLT? Okay, I'm going to assume that the silence means we have no questions. Like I said, at any point, especially for our late joiners, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that throughout. And if you're feeling brave, you can always come off of mute and actually ask a question. Let's move on now to structure. This is a really basic structure that you can use. The essays that you'll actually be writing aren't that long. You do have an hour to write them, and that should be more than enough as well to give yourself some time at the start to plan, which we'll speak a little bit about next, and also that review time, so that you're proofreading and checking spelling and grammar and all of those fun things. Inside of the writing section of structure is the easiest way to make sure that you are ticking off some of the things that we've spoken about on the previous slide. So in your introduction, you want to introduce the topic and any key opinions that you'll be covering across the remainder of your essay. This is a really great time to use some synonyms. So if there are any keywords in the question that you know a synonym for, an introduction is a great time to signal that, especially when you're starting to unpack the topic itself. Once you've done that, you want to start moving into your actual main body paragraphs. These, I've put here like a couple of idioms. So on the one hand, and then you introduce the one main opinion, maybe for an argument or against it, and then move on to the opposite of that as you progress. Let me just, sorry, someone else has just joined the waiting room. Give me one moment. Okay. So yeah, we've covered our introduction. And then we have, on the one hand, a topic sentence, which is a really clear and concise sentence that introduces the main theme or point of a given paragraph. That's all we mean when we say topic sentence. And then you want to include some real life examples or statistics or facts that you have that support the point you're trying to make in this paragraph. Once you've done that, you want to move on to your next paragraph. This covers the flip side, so the reverse point. If you've covered a for argument in the first one, then you want to do against, or vice versa. It's exactly the same structure, but you're considering the other side of the argument, so the other main opinion. Again, I'd recommend using these idiomatic phrases on the one hand, on the other hand, because it helps you tick one of the 6 criteria off really easily. Again, we want a really clear topic sentence to tell us what the main point of your paragraph is, what the argument that you're going to be explaining is, and then some real life examples or statistics or any evidence that you have that supports the argument or that might support the argument. Remember that you don't have to always be giving your opinion. You can consider how somebody else might be thinking as well, and actually that's encouraged. Once you've done that, you've done the bulk of the work, and now you're on to your conclusion. The main points to consider with a conclusion are to keep it quite brief. You don't really want a conclusion being more than 2 or 3 sentences long. And you don't want to introduce any new ideas in a conclusion as well. We want a conclusion to basically be a clear, concise summary of the key points that you've introduced in the other paragraphs, and let us know what your opinion on the matter is. You don't want to be just simply repeating the introduction or introducing any new ideas. We just want a summary of the main body paragraphs, and then to let us know what your final stance on the matter is. So like I say, you can keep that quite brief and concise. That will actually be really well rewarded if you are able to keep that very clear and quite short and snappy. Just let me admit someone else in. Okay, great. Any questions briefly on structure before we move on to how you could, go through like an example plan together just to hammer home some of these points? like I said, we will look as well later in the session at some actual example essays and some model answers. So if you do have any questions on structure, we can look at this with some real life examples later. But anything more on the theory behind this, or different structures or questions about how to plan this out before we move on? Okay, great. Thanks to Sophia in the chat. No questions, that's great. Do let me know if you do have any questions as we move through. For our late joiners, feel free to come off of mute or put something in the chat. Like I say, I'm monitoring that as we go, so do feel free to reach out if anything isn't clear or you need a little bit extra information on anything at all. Okay, so I thought, now we've gone over a structure, we'll go over an example plan that you might look to implement just to revise some of those key ideas. The main thing to take away from this is that you do need a plan. I work with a lot of candidates, a lot of students over the years who say, I don't plan. And we always see that students who take the time, even just 5 minutes at the start of the exam to plan, they always perform better. So do make a point of sketching out even a very, very brief plan for yourself, because it will help you when you come on to actually writing up your essay. And even, you obviously, once you've done your plan, put a cross through it so that the examiner knows that's a plan and not to mark it. But having been an examiner myself, it always reflects really positively on a student who has taken the time to plan, and it puts the examiner in quite a good mood. They're always quite excited to read your essay, knowing that you've given it some thought. So do take time to just give yourself a plan. Like I say, I would recommend in an exam of this length, around 5 to 10 minutes. It depends how quick you are at writing. It can be as short as 5 minutes, nothing longer than 10. So try to aim to be somewhere within that time banding. So if we had, for instance, the example question of, should governments ban shops from selling food that is bad for your health? This kind of question is exactly the kinds of question that you will see crop up on the LLT, ELLT across the years. It prompts you to consider both things for this statement and against it, which is very, very typical of these kinds of questions and these kinds of opinion-based essays. So this is very typical. You might want to practice going over some questions that are very similar. And how do we respond to this? We know that we need an introduction, we need an on the one hand and on the other hand, and a conclusion at the end to briefly summarize. You don't need to spend too much time planning your introduction and your conclusion at all. You might want to note down any key synonyms or pieces of vocabulary that you think are particularly useful for this initially, and that's great, so that you've got them at the forefront of your mind and you remind yourself to include them. That's fine. But when we move on to how do we actually plan the main body of the paragraph, I've put a couple of examples just here on the slide, and like I said, I'll send this out after the session itself. What you really want to do is to split your essay into two. So you want to consider the arguments for something and the arguments against it. So you can see here the main ideas that we might have for banning shops from selling junk food. You can see that one point might be that governments have a duty to protect individuals, also that producers of unhealthy food often target poor people. Once you've written your main idea, and you don't need to brainstorm for each one of these more than 2 to 3 points, nothing more than 3. 2 to 3 points should definitely be enough for you to include in your paragraphs and stay within the word limit of the exam itself. This section here is actually optional. So when you've written and sort of brainstormed the main ideas, it's really useful if you have the time to actually go through what the detail of those points will be, or come up with any examples or facts or evidence that you can use to support that point. So you can see here they're not really including any factual evidence or statistics, but they are starting to unpack and give some details towards the main points, and that's fine. You're not expected in the exam to have, a list of statistics or facts to reel off for every possible thing. It's absolutely fine to just elaborate and give some details and further explanation, which is what this candidate has done here. So this is a great example of someone who's planned for 2 points on the for, elaborated a little bit, and then move on to the against. So you can see here that the main ideas that they've considered against this statement are that adults should be able to make up their own minds, and that a lot of people actually depend on cheaper, unhealthier food across a wider population. Again, we don't have the inclusion of any factual evidence, but we do have quite a long elaboration of the main points that they're trying to argue for. And from a planning perspective, this is great because they can go into writing up the essay knowing exactly what they're trying to say and saving themselves a lot of the thinking time. They can kind of condense most of the thinking into the planning section, and then when writing comes along, they can actually use that time to focus purely on writing. They have a lot more time to focus on things like spelling, grammar, and choosing the right kinds of words. So this can be really valuable from that perspective because it gives you time to think about those 6 things that we spoke about previously, things like appropriateness of language, how fluent do you sound, is your grammar correct, are you using the best kinds of vocab. So this is a really great example plan. Like I say, you don't have to do anything this in depth if you're not comfortable, but what I would recommend at a bare minimum is just to jot down your main ideas for something, main ideas against, even if you don't give any details or examples in your plan, and save those for the essay itself. That's absolutely fine. Again, just to reiterate, this candidate hasn't included any kind of factual evidence. That is okay. You might not have any, you're not expected to have factual evidence on fast food, but if a question comes up on, for instance, the environment or gender equality, you might be able to draw more on some kind of public news or facts that you've read in the media recently to bulk up and support your main arguments. Is everyone clear on this? Kind of the key parts of a plan and the time that it should take. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay, silence is golden. So we'll move on just to our final slide, just some final takeaway tips. And once we've done this, I will get up some of the actual example questions and we can start to talk through them and the model answers together. Final tips to take away then for the writing portion of this exam is remember that when you're writing your essays, the examiners aren't looking for a right or wrong answer. The only thing that the examiner is looking for is your ability to write in English. So your expression, your fluency, how comfortable you are, how confidently writing feels. So don't focus too much. I know we were just speaking about planning and kind of bullet pointing out maybe 4 points just to give you some guidance around the structure. Don't worry and don't think too deeply about the points themselves. The main point is that your English is relevant and written to a high standard. So don't stress too much about the content. As long as you're writing about the topic that they've given you, you should be absolutely fine to kind of score in those higher bands. The next point is actually making sure that you are answering the question. That sounds like a silly point, but every year I work with people who haven't really read the question properly and understood precisely what is asked of them. I'll go into a little bit of detail on this when we look at some of the questions itself, but make sure that if a question asks you about 2 things, so for instance, if there's an and, you're addressing both things in the question, or if they use the word or, you pick one and stick to it. Really do make sure that you've understood exactly what the question is asked for, and then you're tailoring your answer to that. Next point, again, seems like a really basic one, but use bullets in your plans, not in your answers. Make a line through or cross through your plan so that an examiner knows not to mark that. That's really crucial. You want to write all of your sentences in full written English, and again, the planning will help this, but start to itemize your ideas into different paragraphs that relate to a similar idea. This is showing not just your capability from an English perspective, but how well you're able to organize your thoughts and ideas. And a well-organized essay is always going to sound better than one that is a little more skittish and not very formal. Finally, again, I know I've really kind of hammered this home, but do take time to plan your answer before you start writing. And again, at the end, I think I mentioned this earlier on, but for people who join late, do save just 5 to 10 minutes to review your essay at the end for any of those key mistakes that sometimes you don't notice when you're writing. We're thinking things like spelling errors, apostrophes being in the wrong place, checking your verb noun agreements, checking the spelling of your nouns, especially from singular to plural. Those are the kinds of things that when we're writing we might not notice, but if you take just a minute to cool off once you've finished writing and then come back to it with fresher eyes, you will start to notice. So do give yourself that time to go through and error check at the end, because it will make such a difference between the banding. If you do notice a couple of spelling or grammar errors, that could literally be the difference between a score of 8 or 9 and 10 or 11, which are really different. So do take the time to do that. Do we have any questions on anything I've said? Oh, yeah. If I want to plan my essay or take notes, am I allowed to have paper on the table? Would it be monitored? This depends. During COVID, it was slightly different because people were taking some of these tests online. Are you doing your test online, Sophia? Are you doing it in person? I'm guessing if you have paper, you're doing it online. If you're doing it online, it might be monitored if you have paper on the table. I would check with, because there are different places that you can do the tests with, obviously. I would just check with them. Often, if you have paper on the table to kind of plan out a rough plan, it won't be monitored, and it's not something that they would at all kind of penalize you for. That said, just reach out to check and just say, am I allowed any paper to write down as I go? Because it's always best to check those things. I would be very surprised if somewhere where you're sitting the test would monitor something like that, as long as you make it clear that you're using it as a plan. The other option that you can do is actually to plan out kind of in the section where it comes up for you to type your answer. You can always just plan it out there and just delete it, literally kind of control all of it and then delete afterwards. The downside is then that it might affect the word count and the character count whilst you're typing, but you can sort of write a point and delete it as you go. That's another alternative if a specific exam coordinator is going to be concerned about you having paper on the table. So Sophia, I would just reach out and check. Often that won't be. Yeah, okay, so someone has just put in the chat, that you can write notes and then delete it. So you have two options. Have a go with the paper, just reach out and check. If not, write a really basic plan inside of the test portal itself and then just delete it as you move through those points. Hopefully that clarifies that. No worries, that's a great question. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. We've finished the PowerPoint. So just give me 1 second just to exit out of that and to pull up the questions themselves. Okay. So we have 10 mock questions to go through. We probably won't have time to go through all of them. I think these are the ones as well that John did put on the chat, and since there aren't too many of you, I'll start by asking if there are any that people would particularly like to go through. I don't know if any of you have started to do them in your own time. Maybe you've written an example answer and there's a particular one you'd like to focus on. If there are any that you would like to look at in particular, please feel free to come off of me or put the numbers in the chat. And if not, what we'll do is we'll just start by going through them just kind of chronologically. any questions that people would like to focus on? Just give you a time to put it in the chat if there is. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any ones that people want to focus on in particular. Just before we do this, just want to check that has everyone actually received the example essay questions document? Has everyone got that up with them now? If not, I'm able to just post that in the chat. Yep, I can absolutely show you the questions. I've actually just sent the PDF in the chat. I'll also share my screen just to make sure that everyone's got it up. But I would recommend saving this document to your own laptop, just so that you can work through the ones that we don't have time to cover off as preparation for your test. If you're able to, I think there are 10 on this actual document itself. Yeah, if you're able to work through all 10 of these in advance of the test, I can pretty much guarantee that any question that comes up in the test won't throw you or surprise you. So I would really recommend doing some, if not all of these before your test if you can. The absolute best way to practice and kind of be confident in your ability is literally just to rep these out. So go through as many questions as possible, do as many plans as possible. Even if you don't end up writing the essay itself, going through that process of trying to brainstorm ideas and plan and practice doing it in 5 to 10 minutes is really useful. Also, like I said, if it's only going to take you 5 to 10 minutes, it isn't a huge ask on your time. So you can actually, you could practice all of these in one afternoon if you really wanted to. So it's not a huge amount of time, but the reward is really high. So that's something I would really recommend doing. Hopefully now you can all see my screen. I've also put the questions in the chat, so hopefully you will manage to download that. Either or is fine. Any questions on the document itself? Can everyone see the screen? Just want to check that before we start to discuss question number 1. Okay, going to presume from the silence that means everyone can see. That's great. So if we look at question number 1, the question number 1 asks us, or gives us actually a statement. It's clear that gender roles and stereotypes are ingrained in children's lives. Okay, yep, okay, thanks, Dang, for putting number 2 in the chat. We will move on to that once we just do this one first, but yep, thanks for giving us a kind of steer. Okay, so we'll start with question 1, moving on to question 2 after. It's clear that gender roles and stereotypes are ingrained in children's lives from a young age, but it's also clear that young people are struggling to fit in with society's expectations of them. So it's given us a statement. The question is, do you think this will change in the future? Using the structure that we've gone over just now on the PowerPoint, we need to think of an on the one hand and on the other hand. So on the one hand, this will change in the future. On the other hand, it won't change, and why that might be. Does anyone feel confident enough to come off of mute or to put in the chat any kind of, if this was the question that you received in your ELT, what points would you be thinking to brainstorm inside of your plan? What are some of the key points for and against that we might be considering for question number 1? Give you some time to put some responses inside of the chat. That would be great. does anyone have any ideas on how they would begin planning for question 1? Want to put anything in the chat? If not, we can break this one down together. Hold on. Okay, great. Someone's got something going. That's great. I'm just going to get this going at the same time and give Sophia and whoever else some time to put ideas inside of the chat. Just going to move this across. Just give everyone a couple more minutes. You can see on the screen what we'll do is, given this is our first question. Okay, some people putting some ideas in the chat. That's great. Thanks so much for participating. I know Sophia is typing something, so just going to give her a couple more minutes. For everyone else, I'll just explain. We will go through like a quick bullet point plan, just as I was saying, mimicking this stuff here that we've already looked at. From an example perspective, obviously we've got a different question. Does anyone, is there first up, before we kind of move on to that, giving, okay, so Sophia has put, that's great. We'll move on, we'll come on to Deng and Sophia, what you've both put in the chat in a second. Before we do that, are there any pieces of vocabulary in the question title that people aren't clear on? Is there anything that isn't a word that someone doesn't know, or something that people want some clarification on? Okay, great. So we are tasked with, do we think the the society's expectations towards different gender roles will change in the future or not? And thanks to Sophia and Deng in the chat, who've been writing away and thinking of how they might go about planning this question. So Deng, just checking here, so you think that actually this will change in the future? So this is a few comments for people accept more information and embrace different characters. Great, we'll put this inside of our plan. So this is probably more of a point. We'll come back to how to elaborate on that in a second. Also, we have an idea that people are gradually learning to respect others more. Again, another point, we're going to need to elaborate on that just afterwards. We'll review what Sophia has put. So Sophia in the chat, choice of toys for different genders, dolls for girls, car for boys, colors when the child is showing emotion. Okay, great. This is probably more of an elaboration from Sophia, so that's great. Leaning more towards this idea that maybe gender stereotypes are quite ingrained in ways that we wouldn't think. So small things that really enhance how a child experiences their early years, things like the toys that they play with, the colors they're told they're able to like, how they behave in showing their emotions. Great. So definitely this is one of the things that we might put against. Let's first look at how we can elaborate on some of Deng's points. So like I said, we've got a point here, but we probably need to elaborate or give some kind of evidence. So people now accept more information and embrace different characters. Is there any kind of evidence or development of this point that we could give? Remembering that what's really great about Sophia's point here is that she's actually included a lot of real life examples. So we have the example of toys. We also have the example of colors and emotions. So that's really great use of real life examples. Do we have any ideas for what real life examples we could include for either of these arguments that Deng has given us for the idea that change in the future is possible? So for Deng's points 1 and 2 in the chat, any way that we could elaborate on them or give any kind of real life example to show that we are developing our argument here. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to pop any ideas in the chat. If you're feeling brave, of course, you can come off of mute as well. Not sure if people are, maybe some people are typing away. Please keep typing away. I'll put some ideas of ways that we might look to elaborate on that in the PowerPoint now, and then we can add in everyone else's ideas as they come through on the chat. So Deng, one of your first comments for this idea that this will change in the future is that people are now accepting more information and embracing different characters. One of the big examples that we can think of is this is through online interactions or even social media. People are encountering people from different cultures all the time, and it's far easier to meet people from different cultures, different locations in the world than it's ever been before because of the internet and social media. And obviously, as part of this, different cultures do have slightly different attitudes to gender roles. So actually, as you said, we're accepting more information that might challenge some of our own stereotypes from the locations that we're from. And through doing that, we're learning to embrace difference at a far higher degree than before. Sophia's put a point in the chat. I'll just read this out for everyone. I think that the difference nowadays is people who were raised in strict gender roles struggle to fit in, but they are brave enough to educate others on making a change in the future. That's how it's changing right now and will keep changing in the future. Yeah, definitely. So that's actually even another point that we can add in below, that people who did not conform to gender roles are speaking out and encouraging others to be brave enough to live more authentically. That's a great point. You can see what I've tried to do is use other kind of idioms or maybe more formal pieces of vocabulary. These are just, again, some of those 6 points that we spoke about earlier. Remembering that the more kind of ambitious we can be with our vocabulary, the more that we will be rewarded. When we come on to this point of people are learning to respect others, that ties in a lot with this idea of we are challenged more in our perceptions a lot more in today's world. And more and more as time goes on, as Sophia has said, the non-conformity is growing, and that does challenge a lot of perceptions, and it's causing people to respect others. We see a lot of more traditional ideas towards gender roles being challenged, and a growing respect in younger audiences or generations, not just in relation to gender, but other key issues as well. for instance, the climate or social responsibility. So some really great points pointed out from Sophia and Deng there. What we've been able to do is start with a point and actually elaborate it or highlight already a great piece of elaboration. What we've got here from a planning perspective, we were in a plan and we were actually writing this test, we can see we've got a lot of arguments for and just one against. Now that's fine. Even when you're giving a balanced response, you're able to state in your introduction what you'll be arguing. So it might be the case, and it seems like with what people have been putting in the chat and interacting, that actually in this case we would be arguing that this will change in the future. And we've got 3 reasons that we believe it to be. We might end up selecting just 2 of these. When we come on to the against, the key thing that I want us to take away is even if you're arguing that I believe that people will be accepting more information, there's a growing sense of respect in younger generations, and non-conformity is actually rising, that's increasing. When we consider the other opinion, we can use phrases like, on the other hand, other people may think that or may disagree because blah blah blah. So making sure that we're using our sentence starters that show that we're confident with the common idioms, that's going to be really key. This doesn't actually fit on the PowerPoint anymore because everyone's come up with such brilliant ideas, so that's great. This is a really great plan, and you can see actually Sophia's point and some of Deng's that we've been able to elaborate on are already giving us the topic sentences that we would need to start our paragraph. So hopefully it's clear how we can construct a plan and develop what we actually like to call a line of argument. So you'll hear LOA, maybe a lot, line of argument. This is something that you can include inside of your introduction. And that will tell us whether you're going to be arguing for or against a certain idea or question. Here, like I said, we can see from the plan, we have way more ideas for the for, so that's fine. We would just state that we'll be arguing that this will change in the future. However, we'll also be considering why someone might be of the opposite opinion. Deng has just put another idea. Okay, this is also a really good idea from Deng in the chat. I'll just put this over into the PowerPoint. Another idea as to why someone might believe that this actually won't change is that children worry about other people's opinion of them. Watch just the spelling on opinion there, so it's just 1 P. You can also see, actually, this is an interesting point. You guys are using the American spelling of English. That's absolutely fine. In the ELLT, English, British English, American English, and actually Australian English are all recognized as appropriate spelling. So don't stress on that. That's why color is kind of giving us this underline. But yeah, exactly. This is a great point. Children worry about other people's opinion of them. And then this is the example. So Deng, you've done a great job of elaborating here. What you want to start including is these sentence starters like for example, or another great one to use is for instance. And using these kind of sentence starters just helps signal to an examiner that you're about to include an example, a real life example, and we know that that's something that they're looking for. So do remember to include those throughout your essay. They're really helpful to just increase how confident the essay sounds and the idiomatic side of things. So this is great. You can see already that we've got a great plan ahead of us. Oh, dang, another one. This is great participation. Thank you so much. Yeah, exactly. So this is a really good point. Deng has actually put a point here that relates quite well with what Sophia was saying. It's that parents and other adults are teaching children things that condition their attitude towards their own genders. And you can see that that's actually Sophia's point that she's already raised. That Deng's point might be a really good topic sentence for what is Sophia's elaboration. So we can go ahead and insert this actually higher up. And then Sophia's point here is actually our example. So that's a great piece of collaboration, guys. Thanks so much for involving yourselves in that. What you can now see here is actually we've got the makings of almost a complete paragraph. So that's brilliant. Like I say, these other paragraphs, we've got a couple of elaboration points that would prompt us to go on to some real life examples. But that's a really great piece of participation. Really seems like for you guys, it won't be an issue at all coming up with what these points for and against are. That's great. What we'll do now is we'll just have a look also at question 2. If I go back to this point, just because Deng, I know that you called out question 2 as a good example one. Question 2 is really useful as well because we actually have a really long size of quote to work with. So actually it's going to, our essay is actually going to depend on us evaluating the information from the quote, not just disagreeing or agreeing, but actually delving into what's being said in the question itself. We can see that when we look through question 3 is quite short, as is question 4. 5 and 6 are probably around the same length as the one we've just done for question 1. And yeah, a range of shorter to mid-length. So question 2 is quite unique in that the length of the question itself is slightly longer. I'm just going to copy across the question and the quote to the PowerPoint, and then we can get started on that together. Just give me one moment to do that. Okay. Make this a little bit smaller. Hopefully everyone can still see this.